Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala Nabiina Muhammad. Wa ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lah. Wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluhu. Amma ba'd. One thing that is very common today in many of the mosques and many of the lectures and even what is being written about has to do with the current plight of the Muslim Ummah. And actually these kind of lectures have been going on for decades. It's not something new. And therefore, given the plight, given the wars, the violence, the terrorism, everything that is going on with respect to the Muslim Ummah today, it may sound a little unnecessary or a little strange to all of a sudden concentrate on a topic like hasad, which is our topic in these lectures, hasad or envy. But actually the extreme importance of this topic cannot be denied. If we go to the Quran and Sunnah, we see that the Quran and Sunnah discusses and refers to the issue of hasad on many occasions and demonstrates to us the importance of this concept. So if the importance of this concept can be confirmed in the Quran and Sunnah, this is something for the Muslim to wake up and realize that indeed this is an issue which is of extreme importance. So first and foremost, we have the fact that it is something stressed in the Quran and Sunnah, and so therefore we have to take it seriously. And secondly also, and this is something inshallah we'll develop further, as we will also develop the first point further in the lectures, but it is a disease, hasad or envy, is a disease that is very prevalent among the Muslim Ummah today. And unfortunately it is prevalent among even the scholars, even the jama'at, even the people, the du'at, even the people who are working for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We can find this disease existing among them. And even among the common people, even in some remote villages where you don't expect maybe this kind of disease to be so rampant, we find it existing throughout. And finally, another thing which points to the extreme importance of this topic is that the hasad or envy is something that is related to the heart and the role of the heart and the actions of the heart. And this is something which is core to the matter of the issues that we are living in nowadays. Unfortunately, as I alluded to earlier, we're facing many problems, and unfortunately when we try to analyze our contemporary situation, and when we try to figure out what it is that it should be done and what we need to do to help ourselves and bring ourselves and the Muslim Ummah out of this current situation, we find a lot of analysis that seems to be, at least to some extent, missing some of the core issues. I'll just take a couple of examples from books that were written recently. These are written by Muslims. One of them is entitled Globalization or Recolonization: The Muslim World in the 21st Century. And towards the end of the work, for about 10 pages, they discuss, after discussing all of the plight of the Muslim Ummah, and especially the economic plight of the Muslim Ummah, for about 10 pages, they discuss what needs to be done to strengthen the Muslim Ummah and to bring back the Muslim Ummah to what we could call a respected situation. In these 10 pages, they discuss things like strengthening the OIC, the Organization of the Islamic Conference, develop a Muslim monetary fund like the International Monetary Fund, have a united Muslim force that they actually call the IDF, the Islamic Defense Forces. All of these are, of course, secular ideas. They don't get to the root of the problem of even discussing the issues of why, for example, are Muslims fighting each other? Why are Muslims looking towards the West and trying to, for example, import things so much from the West and so much reliant on the West? You know, much of what the West imports are what they call, for example, America's soft power. It is things like entertainment. It's not just technology and things like that, but it is things like entertainment that even the Muslims are purchasing and so forth. So there are some more core issues than just these kind of things that they discussed in that work. Another recent book called The Cross and the Crescent, The Rise of American Evangelism and the Future of Muslims. In this book, the author makes one good point, but then the question is, what does he follow it up with? Speaking about the terrorists, he said the terrorists divert our attention from the real culprit to the irrelevant parties. They make us believe that the West, particularly the U.S., is responsible for the weakness of Muslims, which is a wrong perception. So this is a very good point that he's making. He's saying that our situation, the plight that we're facing nowadays, is not simply what the kuffar are doing. But then right after that, making that good point, he states what is the real weakness of the Muslims nowadays, or the cause of the weakness. He says the real reason for the weakness of the Islamic civilization in the post-colonial period is neither the West in general, nor the United States in particular, but the mismanagement of our societies, resources, and economies by the ruling elites in many countries. So here again, we see that the analysis or the solution to the situation that the Muslims are facing is a secular, you can call it a secular one. Just looking at the situation from a worldly perspective. See, we Muslims, of course, our ultimate purpose, our ultimate goal is not this life, right? We're supposed to be like travelers going through this life. We should not look at our worldly situation, our dunya situation, and expect that all of our problems and solutions can be discussed and solved simply by looking at the worldly situation. Instead, there's something much further that is at work here. You know, we believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We believe that there are other factors that are work in this creation other than simply the material cause and effect that people talk about and people can see in front of them in this world. In fact, there's another hadith of the Prophet ﷺ in which the Prophet ﷺ is describing how the different peoples or the different are going to come upon this nation. As people are invited to come and eat from a dish, and they're going to come upon this nation. And it's interesting that I've heard this hadith, and this portion of the hadith in particular, mentioned in a number of khutbahs and in a number of lectures. And the interesting thing is they just kind of mention part of it, and they do not mention, or they do not realize what is the whole thing in the hadith. Because the hadith after the Prophet ﷺ had mentioned that the other will try to come upon the Muslim ummah, one of the Sahaba of the Prophet ﷺ asked the Prophet ﷺ if that would be because the number of Muslims at that time would be very small. وَمِنْ قِلَّةٍ نَحْنُ يَوْمَئِذٍ, and it would be a small group of people at that time. And the Prophet ﷺ said, no, بَلْ أَنْتُمْ يَوْمَئِذٍ كَثِيرٌ. In fact, you will be numerous, but you will be like the froth on the sea. And Allah will remove from the hearts of your enemies any kind of fear of you. And then the Prophet ﷺ said, وَلَيَقْذَفَنَّ اللَّهُ فِي قُلُوبِكُمُ الْوَهْنَ. Then the Prophet ﷺ said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will cast into your hearts al-wahn. So the problem is not that we're small in number, we're going to be large in number. So the fear in the hearts of the disbelievers will leave, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will put in our hearts al-wahn. And this al-wahn, this is the main reason why we are facing that situation. So the Prophet ﷺ was asked, what is al-wahn? And the Prophet ﷺ said, حُبُّ الدُّنْيَا وَكَرَاهِيَةِ الْمَوْتِ. The Prophet ﷺ said that al-wahn, the thing that he described that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will put in our hearts at that time, the Prophet ﷺ said, it is love of this dunya and dislike for death. Love of this dunya and dislike for death. Now, what is love of this dunya and what is dislike for death? These are actually things that are in the hearts of the individual. These are feelings or emotions that are in the hearts of the individual. He loves something. Love is an expression of something in the heart, right? So he loves something. What does he love? Unfortunately, he loves this dunya. And he dislikes something. He hates something. What does he hate? He hates the death. He hates the fact, or he hates the idea of preparing and knowing that he'll have to face death, and all of this will come to an end. So here in this hadith, and also there's other relevant hadith we could quote, shows that the source of our problem, for example, is not the fact that the Prophet ﷺ did not say that at one time you're going to be weak and people are going to rule over you because you're going to stop trading among yourselves and start trading with the kuffar and not have your own economic system or something of that nature. All of these dunya things are simply ramifications, actually, of other problems, which are the core issues. And the main thing about them, when you look at them, is that they have to do with the heart. What is in the heart of the Muslim? So we can say that the heart is actually the heart of the matter. The question, first and foremost, is what is occurring to the Muslims within their hearts. And there is a verse in the Quran, a well-known verse that has had the effect in the past to change individuals. Just this one verse, when certain people had read it, they became changed by this verse. And this verse is an important verse because it tells us the fact that over time, actually, our hearts can become hardened, can become diseased. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, أَلَمْ يَأْنِ لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا أَن تَخْشَعَ قُلُوبُهُمْ لِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ وَمَا نَزَلَ مِنَ الْحَقِّ وَلَا يَكُونُوا كَالَّذِينَ أُوتُوا الْكِتَابَ مِن قَبْلُ فَطَالَ عَلَيْهِمُ الْأَمَدُ فَقَسَتْ قُلُوبُهُمْ وَكَثِيرٌ مِّنْهُمْ فَاسِقُونَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, has not the time arrived for the believers that their hearts be humbly affected by Allah's reminder and the truth which has been revealed to them? And they should not become like those to whom were given the revelation beforehand, but long ages passed over them and their hearts grew hard. In fact, many among them are fasiqun, rebellious transgressors. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking to the believers and reminding us that our hearts should become humble and really almost, you can say, crushed to the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and submission to the remembrance or what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has revealed of the truth. And we must be very careful not to become like those people who before us. So after a while, when the Quran was fresh, when Islam was fresh, it wasn't generation after generation growing up and seeing themselves simply as I'm a Muslim, I grew up as a Muslim, my parents are Muslim, my grandparents are Muslim, and so therefore it is like a label that's upon them. And there's no emotion, there's no excitement about the fact that they are Muslim. And this can happen over time. This happened to the people before us. So the hearts become hard. We hear the Quran, it doesn't have much effect upon us because we think, okay, we're Muslim and we really don't have to pay that close attention. When a Muslim, when a ummah, when any nation gets into a situation like that, then this is a very dangerous situation for that nation. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes those people before us who had gotten into that kind of situation. وَكَثِيرٌ مِّنْهُمْ فَاسِقُونَ. That the majority or many of them are actually fasiqun, evildoers. Yet right after this verse in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala leaves us though with some hope. Because even if we are facing that kind of situation, even if we see ourselves that we are a kind of ummah or a kind of people where the Quran or the revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not having much of an effect upon us, our hearts are kind of become cold to that and we're into other things, we are loving other things and excited about other things, we're no longer excited about the revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Even when that occurs to us, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then says after that, أَعْلَمُوا أَنَّ اللَّهَ يُحْيِي الْأَرْضَ بَعْدَ مَوْتِهَا. And one of the meanings of this that we can get from this expression that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and know that Allah revives the earth after its death. Part of that, obviously, we know that this can be a reference to the fact that we will be resurrected and we'll have to face Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So therefore we have to be awake, we have to awaken now and change ourselves before that time. But it also is a clue to the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can change, can revive our hearts. If we turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sincerely, then inshallah, in the same way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revives the land after it is dead, then inshallah Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will revive our hearts. So therefore, inshallah, in today's lecture, as an introduction to the concept of al-hasad or envy, which we'll be speaking about in the upcoming lectures, I want to discuss first the place of the heart and the worship of the heart and the central role that the heart has to play. And as I said, this is not something that we should take lightly. This is something that we have to really think about. And unfortunately, it is a topic, for whatever reason, it is a topic that is not stressed that much nowadays among the Muslims. In fact, if you look at even our da'wah material, if you look at what we are presenting out there, what we are giving out there for others to learn about Islam, and at the same time, even if you look at the introductory books about Islam written by non-Muslims as well, when people think about Islam, unfortunately, it seems it has gotten to this state that when people think about Islam, whether we're talking about Muslims or whether we're talking about non-Muslims, when they think or present Islam, we see that in general they have a tendency to stress the outward aspects of Islam. You know, the 5 pillars, you have to pray, you have to fast, and so forth. And there is some discussion, obviously, about the beliefs, that you have to believe in Allah, you have to believe in the last day, believe in the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. There's usually very little discussion, though, about the other aspects of the heart. Besides the belief in Allah, what is supposed to be in the heart of the believer? Is it just the fact that he says he believes in these things and then he goes and prays and fasts, and there's nothing else also which are aspects which should be in his heart and should be developed in his heart? I mean, people have to be taught these things, they have to learn these things so that they will think about them and they will recognize them. Don't just think that, okay, it'll come to them if they believe in God and the Prophet and the last day and they go and pray and fast. All of these things will also come to them. They may come to them, may be part of the effect of the salat that all of these things will come to them. However, at the same time, it will be helpful for everyone if these things are discussed explicitly and explained explicitly, that there's certain emotions or certain feelings, certain attributes that should be in the heart of the believer. And there's no excuse for these things not to be in the heart of the believer. And in fact, if someone doesn't have some of these things in the heart, then he may not even have Islam at all, as we'll discuss shortly, inshallah. So the introductory, or when we talk about Islam, when we convey Islam to others, we have to tell them also that Islam is not simply belief in certain articles and then practices, but also the aspects of the heart, the actions of the heart also have to be there. And of course, this is not just for non-Muslims, this is not just for new Muslims, but even people who have been Muslim for a long time. In our khutbahs and our lectures and everything, we also have to keep reminding ourselves of the heart, the central role of the heart, what is healthy for the heart, what is harmful for the heart, and so forth. Even the act of becoming a Muslim, this is something which is what we call belief in the heart, right? It is actually belief. It is not simply belief in the mind, but when someone becomes Muslim, it is actually a change in what is in their hearts. So even the first step of becoming Muslim actually is supposed to be a change in something which is in the heart. The heart had a certain feeling or approach to something else, and now it is now having a new feeling towards Islam and towards submitting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the outward actions that we do, like the prayer, the fasting, the giving of charity, any of the outward aspects that we do, no matter how kind, no matter how good they may look, actually, if those outward aspects are void of what is supposed to be in the heart, then in reality those outward aspects are not really going to have much, if any, effect when we meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As the Prophet ﷺ has told us, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَنْظُرُ إِلَى أَجْسَادِكُمْ وَلَا إِلَى صُوَرِكُمْ وَلَكِنْ يَنْظُرُوا إِلَى قُلُوبِكُمْ. The Prophet ﷺ said, verily Allah does not look at your bodies or your shapes, but He looks at your hearts. And then the Prophet ﷺ pointed to his chest. So it is not necessarily the outward aspects first and foremost, but it is what is in the heart that is of most concern. And it certainly is not. One thing is for certain, it is certainly the key when we meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is certainly not what we can amass in this world. The wealth and everything that people are so concerned about in this world, and even those books that I referred to earlier seem to be thinking that that's the key for changing the Muslim Ummah and making the Ummah strong again. This is certainly not what we are all about and what is most important to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In fact, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, in the words of Ibrahim, يَوْمَ لَا يَنْفَعُ مَالٌ وَلَا بَنُونَ إِلَّا مَنْ أَتَى اللَّهَ بِقَلْبٍ سَلِيمٍ. The day when wealth and sons avail not anyone save him who brings unto Allah a sound heart. So on that day in which we meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we're all very much aware of that day and what that day means, on that day when we meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's not going to be our wealth, it's not going to be our children, it's not going to be these things of this dunya actually that are going to benefit us the most. In fact, those things are not going to be the key issue. The key issue is the one who comes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with a sound heart. His heart has the proper beliefs, his heart has the proper feelings and emotions and deeds that we'll talk about later, inshallah. Prophet ﷺ also said, لا يستقيم إيمان عبد حتى يستقيم قلبه. The Prophet ﷺ said that the faith of a person will not be sound and upright until his heart is made sound and upright. لا يستقيم إيمان عبد حتى يستقيم قلبه. You will not actually have a completely sound and correct iman, faith, unless what is in your heart is also sound and correct and proper. In another hadith, the Prophet ﷺ said, ألا وإن في الجسد مضغة إذا صلحت صلح الجسد كله وإذا فسدت فسد الجسد كله ألا وهي القلب. The Prophet ﷺ said that in the body there is a morsel of flesh, which if it is sound and holy, then all of the body is sound, and which if it is rotten, all of the body is rotten. And this part of the body is the heart. And in fact, when you think about it, the heart is actually the master, you can say, of the rest of the body. The rest of the body, the actual physical acts that you do, the things that you do in this physical world, are the result of the commands that come from the heart. So the heart is the commander, and the limbs and the body are like the soldiers. So therefore, if the heart is good, then the thing that the body will do will be good, and everything will be good. But if the heart is evil, if the heart is rotten, then the thing that the body will do will be evil. Thus, we find Ibn al-Qayyim writing that, saying that the one who studies the sources of the Sharia will know the relationship between the external actions of the limbs and the actions of the heart. The deeds are not beneficial without the actions of the heart. The actions of the heart are more of an obligation upon the person than the actions of the limbs. This is what he said. He said the actions of the heart are more of an obligation upon the person than the actions of the limbs. It doesn't mean the actions of the limbs are not important. But if you don't have that source, if you don't have the foundation, then what are the actions of the limbs actually going to benefit you? So therefore, Ibn al-Qayyim continues, he says, isn't a believer distinguished from a hypocrite simply due to the actions in their hearts that are different from each other? Can anyone enter into Islam except by the actions of his heart before the actions of his limb? So here Ibn al-Qayyim, he is, and we'll talk about this more later, Ibn al-Qayyim is emphasizing the fact that if you don't have what you're supposed to have in the heart, especially the obligatory, the mandatory aspects, then the deeds actually are not worth anything. This is what distinguishes a believer from a disbeliever. This is what distinguishes a true believer from a hypocrite. This is what distinguishes actually a pious person from an evildoer and so forth. It all goes back to what is in the heart. And therefore what is in the heart then will have an effect on the worldly thing also. So, as I said earlier, as I began the lecture, a lot of people look at the plight of the Muslim, the worldly plight of the Muslim community, and they see all sorts of problems that exist within the worldly plight of the Muslim community. Well, in essence, that situation is caused by what is in the heart. And this we can see by thinking about what is the Sharia. The Sharia, the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has actually come for the benefit of mankind in both this world and in the hereafter. We are not, for example, like the Christians who say their kingdom is in the next world, and therefore they don't really have the laws in their religion to lead them in this life. Allah's kingdom, if you want to say it like this, it is both to be implemented here and also, and in perfect form, in the hereafter. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in His revelation to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam has given us guidance for the external actions of life. But for the external actions to be completely proper and to be sound and for people to be led to what will be beneficial for them in this life, the source or the root of what is in the heart has got to be there. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the revelation has given us both what we need for the heart as well as what we need for the external deeds. So if we have what is in the heart, inshallah we'll follow the external deeds properly. If we don't have what is in the heart, then once we don't have what is in the heart, then we find it difficult to abide by what we're supposed to abide by with respect to the external deeds. So then when we don't abide by those external deeds, then we do all sorts of wrong and harmful actions, and then the Muslim Ummah becomes weaker and weaker and weaker, and then we can see the plight of the Muslim Ummah as we see it today. So for example, the situation, the kind of things like drinking alcohol or committing zina and so forth, if the feelings that are supposed to be in the heart are there in the heart, then the person will stay away from these things. But if the feelings that are supposed to be in the heart are not there, then the person will easily be overcome by these things. He will get engaged in these things. And those evils have other ramifications for society and cause other evils in society and so forth. In essence, what we have to think about is the place of the heart, the role of the heart, and how the heart has to be made sound. This is essential for us as individuals. It is essential for us as a Muslim community. You know, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks in the Quran about the disbelievers, about those people who are away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and not enjoying the benefits of the beauty of this religion and the benefits of the guidance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you'll see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes them very often by their hearts. What is in their hearts, or what is the nature or the status of their hearts. Without quoting all the verses just for the sake of time, we see for example that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the hearts of the unbelievers in 10 different ways in the Quran. And these are in various verses, sometimes more than one description is given in different verses. So for example, in the opening verses in Surah Al-Baqarah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the hearts of the disbelievers as being sealed. In Surah Al-An'am, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes their hearts as being dead. In Surah Muhammad verse 29, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes their hearts as being diseased. In An-Nisa, their hearts are closed. In Al-An'am, their hearts are narrow. In Al-Mutaffifin, their hearts are rusted. In Zumar and Al-Baqarah again, their hearts are hardened. In At-Tawbah, their hearts are turned away. In Al-Fath, their hearts are zealous for the age of ignorance. Yani they desire the time of ignorance. And in Surah Al-Nahl, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes their hearts as refusing to know. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is describing the disbelievers in all of these different places in the Quran by what? By their heart. So this is 10 different, actually more than 10 different places in the Quran in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is describing first and foremost what is the disbeliever. It has to do with what is in his heart. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us all of these different descriptions. And again, we have to learn from what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us in the Quran. We have to be very alert when we read the Quran. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is describing all of this about the hearts of the disbelievers. And also in many places Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the hearts of the believers. But what this is telling us, or what we should get from this, is that this issue of what is the heart and how is the heart and what is the health and the state of the heart, this is essential. Many times people, for example, they think about the physical health of their heart, and they try to make sure that their physical health is good by exercising and so forth and having the proper diet. But at the same time, maybe they're neglecting the spiritual health of the heart. And this is the thing that we as Muslims must be very aware of. We would never want to do anything like this. And in fact, it is essential. It is essential that we always have some kind of feeling about the state of our heart. That we always are kind of keeping an eye on, if I may say it like that, keeping an eye on our hearts and what is going on with our hearts. Because we cannot simply rest on our laurels and say, Alhamdulillah, I am Muslim and I am satisfied, nothing is going to happen to me or anything of that nature. No, in fact, the heart, even by its definition in the Arabic language, qalb, it is very clear that the heart can be swayed. It can be moved. So we have to be very concerned about what is happening with respect to our hearts. Anas ibn Malik said that the Prophet ﷺ used to often make this dua. The Prophet ﷺ used to say, Ya muqallib al-qulub, thabbit qalbi ala dinik. The Prophet ﷺ used to often say, Oh, the one who turns the hearts, confirm my heart upon your religion. The Prophet ﷺ is making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and describing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by this expression, the one who turns the hearts. So he's asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you who have the ability to turn the hearts, you who does turn the hearts, keep my heart firm and confirmed upon your religion. Anas, because he heard the Prophet ﷺ make this dua often, asked the Prophet ﷺ. And he said to the Prophet ﷺ, we believe in you and we believe in what you have brought for us, what you have brought to us. So therefore, do you have any fear for us? You know, we believed. We believe in you, we believe in what you have brought, everything that you have come with. So why do you fear? Do you have some kind of fear for us, even though we believe in you and believe in what you brought? The Prophet ﷺ said, Na'am, yes. إن القلوب بين أصبعين من أصابع الله يقلبها كيف يشاء. The Prophet ﷺ said that, yes, I do fear for you, because the hearts are between two of the fingers of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. يقلبها, he turns them. This is from the same root as the word qalb for heart. He turns them any way that he wishes. And one of the main things, I guess, that we can get from this hadith is that when someone becomes complacent about his religion, this is something very dangerous. One should never become complacent about one's religion, one's relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and just assume that it will continue. Because the hearts are between the two fingers of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and He can turn them at any time in any way that He wishes, in any manner that He wishes. So instead of being complacent, now why would Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala turn our heart? Of course, we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't do things without reason, without wisdom behind them. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to turn the heart of a person when he himself starts becoming lackadaisical, or he himself doesn't cherish the belief in the thing that he has. So if it's not important to him, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will turn him away and take it away from him. So instead of being complacent and just thinking, Alhamdulillah, I am Muslim, and so therefore I will always have this inshallah, instead of being complacent, we must be very careful and always be checking our iman and checking our hearts and checking what is in our heart. What is it that we're striving for? What is it that we're loving? What is it that we're being overcome by today as opposed to yesterday, this week as opposed to last week, this year as opposed to last year. For example, if we find ourselves all of a sudden we're loving this dunya more than anything else, well, this is obviously a dangerous sign, as in the hadith that we discussed earlier. But if we're not reflecting upon that, if we're not keeping an eye on what is going on in our hearts, and we are simply, for example, to take the analogy of the physical heart, you have all these signs. You may have chest pains and so forth. If you just ignore them, what do you expect? You might end up having catastrophe on your head, a medical catastrophe on your head. Well, similarly, if you're not keeping an eye on what's happening with your heart, your spiritual heart, your attachment to Islam, your attachment to the prayers, your attachment to the revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you're not keeping an eye on that, then before you know it, maybe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will have you turned your heart completely away, or if not completely away, to some extent away, and before you know it, your heart is very much diseased. And when your spiritual heart becomes diseased, like your physical heart, then you have to take some steps to revive your heart, to bring it back to proper state, inshallah. And there are some steps for that, but that is beyond the realm of this lecture. As most of you know, I have a tendency, let's say, to get into some topics a little bit longer than I need to. This is just supposed to be an introduction to the concept of al-hasad, so therefore we'll try to restrict our discussion here of the place of the heart as much as we can, inshallah. But what this point though leads us to is that we have to realize that some things can affect our hearts. Some things can have, for example, a negative effect upon our hearts. And to know what those things are, obviously the first thing that we should check is go back to the Quran, go back to the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ and see what we can find. And I've just taken some examples here, inshallah. One of the things that affects our heart, obviously, is to commit a sin. Now, there's kind of a dynamic relationship between the actions and the sins and the good deeds and what is in the heart. We have to realize that one has an effect upon the other. And the thing that can occur is that things can spiral and get out of hand. So, for example, if there's some weakness in the heart, it'll lead the person maybe to commit a sin. That'll be an opening for the person to commit a sin. That sin, in turn, will affect the heart. Now, again, if the person is not wise in seeing what's going on and therefore repent and changes his ways to remove that effect of that sin, if he's not aware of it, then that weakness in the heart can lead to another sin, which again affects the heart, which leads to maybe a greater sin, which again affects the heart, which leads to a greater sin and so forth, to the point that the heart can be completely sealed and rusted. And this is described actually in the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ has told us, إِنَّ الْعَبْدَ إِذَا أَخْطَأَ خَطِئَةً نُكِتَتْ فِي قَلْبِهِ نُكْتَةٌ سَوْدَاء فإذا هو نزع واستغفر وتاب سقل قلبه وإن عاد زيد فيها حتى تعلو قلبه وهو الران الذي ذكر الله كلا بل ران على قلوبهم ما كانوا يكسبون. So here the Prophet ﷺ is telling us that whenever a believer commits a sin, a black dot will be engraved in his heart. So if he refrains or if he pulls back from that sin and seeks forgiveness and repents, then his heart will be polished again. So this sin that you commit has an effect on the heart. And again, if you're aware of it, if you're wise and know what's going on, inshallah you will repent and inshallah that will remove that sin. So the Prophet ﷺ said that if he refrains, seeks forgiveness and repents, his heart will be polished again. If he returns, so then if he goes back though to that sin, if he allows that weakness to continue and come back into his heart, if he returns, it increases until it overtakes his heart. And this is the stain that is mentioned by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a verse in the Quran, Surah Al-Mutaffifin, verse 14. No, but on their hearts is the stain from that which they used to do. So because of the actions that they do, it causes this stain, this disease to be in their hearts. So, most obvious thing that we can get from this hadith is that committing sins affects the heart. And if we allow it to go unchecked, it can affect the heart to such an extent that the heart can become completely rusted or completely sealed. There's another hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, and we've actually already referred to this hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, and it is also a hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ is telling us or is alluding to the heart. But with respect to this particular hadith, many people don't seem to grasp or don't emphasize the relationship between the different parts of this hadith. Earlier, we quoted the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, in which the Prophet ﷺ said, "Ala wa inna fil jasadi mudghah," that verily in the body there is a piece of flesh. And then he went on that if it is good, then the whole body is good, and so forth. This statement from the Prophet ﷺ is actually part of a longer hadith. And this hadith is the hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ said, "Inna al-halala bayyinun wa inna al-harama bayyin." That the things that are halal, that are permissible, are very clear. What is halal is clear, and the things that are forbidden also are clear. And between them, the Prophet ﷺ continued, between them there are matters which are doubtful, concerning which not many among mankind know what is the correct opinion. So then the Prophet ﷺ said that he who avoids these doubtful matters clears himself in regard to his religion and his honor. And then the hadith continues, but he who falls into the doubtful matters falls into that which is unlawful, like the shepherd who pastures around a sanctuary, all but grazing therein. Verily every king has a sanctuary, and Allah's sanctuary is his prohibitions. And then the Prophet ﷺ said, in the body there is a morsel of flesh, the hadith, the portion that we quoted earlier. So what is the relationship between these two portions of the hadith, where all of a sudden at the end he mentions the heart, that if the heart is good, then everything is good, and the fact that the halal is clear and the haram is clear, and between them there are doubtful matters? Well, the scholars who comment upon this hadith, they said that the relationship between these two are obvious. That if the person does what is halal, and he refrains from what is haram, and he avoids those matters which are doubtful, his heart will become pure, his heart will become salih, his heart will become good. But if he allows himself to fall into those doubtful matters, then his heart may be affected by those doubtful matters. So the relationship between the forbidden matters and the heart is clear. But even the doubtful matters, the person, if he really wants to purify his heart and make sure that his heart is sound, he should stay away from even those doubtful matters. So we have the sins that we talked about in the previous hadith, that the sins will definitely have an effect on the heart. And we also have even the doubtful matters. If one really wants to make sure, inshallah, that his heart is clean and pure and sound and wholesome, then he should even try to avoid the doubtful matters, as can be derived from this hadith. Now we also find in other hadith of the Prophet ﷺ how the actions that we perform as a community can also affect our hearts as a community, and if they affect our hearts as a community, in turn, they're going to make matters even worse for the community. We find this in a number of hadith, for example, in which the Prophet ﷺ is speaking about straightening the rows in the prayer. Okay, now, a lot of people may think straightening the rows in the prayer are not that important. Especially those people, unfortunately, if I may be allowed to make this comment, especially those people who are most concerned maybe with political issues, they will think that this kind of issue, straightening the row in the prayer, is not very important. They have sometimes, not all of them, obviously, alhamdulillah, but some of them sometimes have a tendency to belittle for example, the acts of worship, these like straightening the rows in the prayer, and just try to emphasize what is happening to the Muslim Ummah today and how we have to correct and change the political status of the Muslim Ummah and so forth. In more than one hadith, the Prophet ﷺ has told us that we have to straighten our lines in the prayer, and if we do not straighten our lines in the prayer, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will cause dissension in our hearts. Okay, if we do not straighten the lines in the prayer, and this is, if you've ever studied, for example, sociology or economy or economics or any of these social sciences, there's no way to explain how things happen in the world as a whole or as a society as a whole. Here in this hadith, the Prophet ﷺ, and again, there's many hadith with this meaning. The Prophet ﷺ has told us that either you have to straighten the lines in the prayer, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will cause differences among your hearts. For example, in one hadith, the Prophet ﷺ said, "Wallahi la tuqimunna sufufakum, or la yakhlifan Allah bayna qulubikum." He said, by Allah, after he gave them the order 3 times, aqimu sufufakum, to make your line straight. He said this 3 times, and then he said, by Allah, either you straighten the lines in the row, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will cause dissension among your hearts. One of the things that people stress when they talk about the Muslim Ummah and the situation that we're in nowadays, they talk about the disunity of the Muslim Ummah, and we have to work together in Muslim Ummah. We have to strengthen, for example, as they said, strengthen the OIC and have a Islamic monetary fund instead of the International Monetary Fund and so forth. Well, this is what the Prophet ﷺ is telling us, that if we do not obey these commands, which are given to us by the Prophet ﷺ, or given to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then these commands, when we do not obey them, they have ramifications. They have ramifications on our hearts. And if they have ramifications on our hearts, that's going to have ramifications on our deeds. That's going to have ramifications on the society, the community, and the whole Muslim Ummah as a whole. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to cause dissension among our hearts because we are not making the line straight in the prayer, well, don't you think that dissension among our hearts is going to be part of those communal problems, those problems of the Ummah as a whole that everyone is talking about nowadays? But we don't, it seems, Wallahu alam, it seems that we don't want to face the real essence of our problems. We don't want to turn back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and repent to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and make our hearts pure and make sure that we follow those steps that make our hearts pure, and then inshallah everything else will follow. We have to take care of the core issue first, and then those secondary issues. As I said, we're not mostly concerned about the dunya. The dunya is not our ultimate purpose, right? Our ultimate purpose is to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we have to take care of the core issue first. And then, inshallah, when we take care of the core issues, the other issues, the benefits of that, the ramifications of that, all that will fall into place. But we cannot continue to ignore the core issues and forget about what are the core issues that we must be taken care of. So those are some of the things that we can see that affect the hearts: committing sins, falling into doubtful matters. In this last one, we can say that this is kind of a communal sin, right? As they say here in America, it takes 2 to tango. Well, if you want to make the line straight, that means everyone has to make the line straight in the prayer, right? You cannot make the line straight by yourself. I've tried, and other people have tried. You cannot make the line straight. If one person is up here on this side and the other one is behind you, that means the line's going to be crooked no matter how much you may try to work to make it straight. So all of us have to work together to make the line straight. Inshallah, if all of us work together to make the line straight, we will be blessed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to avoid, inshallah, this dissension among our hearts. And as I said, then other ramifications will come up from that. These points that we've mentioned, they highlight and they demonstrate the place of the heart and the importance of tending to the heart and worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by the actions of the heart as well. Okay, the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not simply the outward deeds that we do. Okay, if this is our understanding of worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then our understanding of the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is extremely defective. The worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not simply by the external deeds that we're doing. The prayers, the fasting, the giving of zakat, the avoiding of drinking alcohol and so forth. These are all, inshallah, good deeds and all acts of worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but they are not all that there is to the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in fact, if you want to compare the worship that is done by the heart, if you want to compare that to the worship that is done by the body, we'll find that actually the worship of the heart is much more important and has greater ramifications than the worship of the physical body. So we can take some comparisons between the two. The first point, which is a point that I've already alluded to on many occasions, is that if we are missing certain components of the worship of the heart, in reality that means that the worship of the body may be completely useless, or in particular cases will be completely useless. For example, if we are missing ikhlas in our hearts, we are not doing things purely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and only for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We are not worshipping anything else other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we are not doing deeds other than for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If we are missing this ikhlas in our hearts, especially if we are missing it, we can say completely, like for example the hypocrites. The hypocrites do all of the acts, at least some of them, especially during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. They were careful to do many of the outward acts of Islam, right? They wanted to be seen as Muslims, so they were careful to do the outward acts, but they had no ikhlas in their hearts, and so therefore all of those acts don't mean anything. None of them are of any value whatsoever. So if you are missing something which is in the heart, especially an essential component like ikhlas, then the physical actions actually mean nothing. We can also see that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes some of the highest ranks in paradise and some of the greatest rewards in the hereafter, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes them with respect to some of the acts of the heart. For example, the Prophet ﷺ said that on the Day of Judgment, قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إن الله يقول يوم القيامة أين المتحابون بجلالي اليوم أذلهم في ذلي يوم لا ذل إلا ذلي. The Prophet ﷺ has told us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will say on the Day of Judgment, where are those who loved one another for my sake, due to my greatness? Today I shall shade them under my shade, a day in which there will be no shade other than my shade. So the only ones who will be receiving shade are those who receive the shade of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and among those will be those people whom Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who loved each other for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And what is that love? Again, that is something which is in the heart. In another narration of this hadith, found in Tirmidhi, the first one was from Sahih Muslim, and the one from Tirmidhi, the Prophet ﷺ has told us, يقول رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال الله المتحابون في جلال لهم منابر من نور يغبطهم النبيون وشهداء. The Prophet ﷺ has told us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that those who love each other for His sake, due to His greatness, they will have minbars of light. So we're talking about in the hereafter, they'll have minbars of light that the prophets and the martyrs would wish that they would have. So there is a special reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that goes to the people who have certain acts of worship. They're fulfilling certain acts of worship in their hearts. And one of the reasons that some scholars point out why the reward is greater for the acts of the heart, and that is because in reality the acts of the heart, the deeds of worship that are done by the heart, are actually greater and more difficult than the outward deeds. You see, when you think about the outward deeds, like even the salat, even those people who have no iman in their hearts whatsoever, the hypocrites, for example, and people who are very weak of faith, they can pray. Right? They can pray, they can fast, even if they don't really have much iman in their hearts. They may pray or fast even for completely the wrong reasons, right? Just to be seen, or just because of communal pressure or whatsoever. So anyone can do the outward acts. The outward act can be performed by anyone. Even we have sometimes disbelievers going to make Hajj just to see what the Hajj is like and to write about the Hajj and so forth. So those things can be done by anyone, but only the true servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, only those who are truly dedicated to and love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they're the only ones who can do the actions of the heart, the actions of worship of the heart. Anyone can do the physical deeds, but the real worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by the heart can only be done by those who are truly pious, who are truly devoted to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it is a great thing. One of the Salaf, I remember, he said that he became Muslim and he was able to do the acts of worship after becoming Muslim, but he also said that it took years for him to remove the love and the devotion to the idols that he had, or the false gods that he had in his heart before Islam. So submitting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and inshallah, I mean, this submitting is also proper and acceptable to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is one thing. A person one day can be non-Muslim, he can become Muslim the next day, and he'll submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by praying and fasting and whatever. But to have his heart now pure and free of all of the diseases that it had before and all of the things that it loved and was found delight in and so forth before Islam, outwardly he maybe can refrain from many. He can refrain from going to worship idols. He can refrain from zina, and he can refrain, if someone has a strong will, he can overcome these things. But in his heart, he may still have a desire and a love for those things, and that may take him a long time for that to get out of his heart. So the worship, the actual physical worship, even though some people may complain it's difficult, that's a different story, I guess. The actual physical worship can be done even by people who don't have much iman in their hearts. And so that's easier than to really fulfill the actions of worship that are supposed to be in the heart. And so therefore, as some scholars said, therefore the reward for the actions in the heart and the acts of worship from the heart, first of all, since they are pure just for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and cannot be done for any other reason, right? Because no one will know what's in your heart. So when these actions are done in the heart, when these acts of worship are done in the heart, they have to be pure for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So they are pure, and they are also more difficult to achieve. So therefore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be more pleased by them, and the reward for them, inshallah, will be greater. We also see that the act in the heart can make the physical act even greater. So what is in the heart also will affect the quality and the results of the action that is being done. In other words, the niyyah, if the intention behind an act is extremely pure for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and combines maybe many types of pure intentions behind it, that niyyah behind that act may have such an effect that it may make a small act, what seems like a small act, become very great. While on the other hand, if the intention behind an act is not, it is pure, but it's not completely that great or that strong in the heart, then it may take an act which is otherwise very great and very important and may make that act small. In fact, we see from the examples that the Prophet ﷺ has given us that the intention itself, which again, the intention is something in the heart, okay? What you really want, what you truly and sincerely really want. So that intention in the heart can actually produce a reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala which is beyond the deeds that someone has performed. We see that, for example, when the Prophet ﷺ told a woman whose father had died, and he had the intention to go out to make jihad, but he died before he was able to do so. So his daughter knew that this was his intention. He wanted to make jihad and he wanted to die as a shaheed. So his daughter said to him that, I wish you had died a martyr, for you had prepared for it. I wish you had died a martyr, for you had prepared for it. And so the Prophet ﷺ said, فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ قَدْ أَوْقَعَ أَجْرَهُ عَلَيْهِ عَلَى قَدْرِ نِيَّتِهِ. The Prophet ﷺ said that Allah has given his reward for him according to the extent of his intention. So the intention, or what is in the heart, can make someone reach a level beyond even what he's done in the physical world. He wasn't able to go out in jihad and die as a martyr, but because of the fact that he really had that intention in his heart. So in other words, the deed of the heart, what was in the heart, will cause him, inshallah, to get the reward, even though he did not actually physically perform that deed. Another case, when the Prophet ﷺ was out on an expedition, as recorded by Al-Bukhari and Muslim, the Prophet ﷺ has said that in Medina we have left some people behind. That they are back in Medina, but we do not go through any valley or any ravine, except that they are with us in reward. They will be rewarded with us as we go through these different steps on our jihad and our expedition, because they have just been kept behind due to valid excuses. In other words, they wanted to make jihad, the intention was there, but due to some valid reasons, they were not able to perform the jihad, and so therefore they will be rewarded just for what is in their hearts, even though they were not able to actually physically carry out what they had intended and what was in their hearts. So the heart, as we see here, what is in the heart can benefit the person greatly. I think on this point, due to the time, and we want also to open the floor for question or comments, we'll have to stop here, and we will continue. Basically, the last few points, what I've been doing here, I've been distinguishing the worship of the heart, and why is that so important and even more beneficial from the worship of the physical body. Not that the physical body, again, is unimportant. Don't misunderstand me or don't misinterpret me. They both go together, but what is in the heart is more important and has a greater effect, and this is what we're doing right here. We're just making some points, what distinguishes the worship of the heart from the worship of the physical body, and why is it so important that we tend to meaning we take care of what is happening with our heart, what is the state of our heart, and what is the spiritual health of our heart. So inshallah, on that point, I will stop and open the floor for inshallah any questions or comments that you might have.
For further information, please contact Al-Bashir Publications and Translations at 1-877-745-3330 or 303-574-0095. Our fax number is 303-373-0943, or visit our website at www.albashir.com. That's www.al-basheer.com. You can also write to our address at 3700 Havana Street, Unit Number 102, Denver, Colorado 80239. All rights reserved for Al-Bashir Company for publications and translations. No part of this series may be reproduced in any form without the written permission from the publisher. Unlawful reproduction may prevent Muslim businesses from further producing quality programs. Your consideration is greatly appreciated.